Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about drawing the chest. I spent almost a few days drawing almost nothing but the chest, just to kind of really observe what it is that I'm thinking about when drawing it. And I came up with a few things that I'd like to talk about, so without wasting any more time, this is notes for how to draw the chest. So like with any muscle on the body that we study, it's always a good idea to look at where those muscles that we're studying attach to on the actual skeleton. Which of course leads me to the first thing that I'd like to focus on, which is the clavicle, or in other words, the collarbone. Now there are a couple things about the clavicle that are pretty important, but the point that I'd like to get across for now is that the space between the two collarbones will always give you the center line of the chest. So when we look at a diagram of the chest, or in other words, the pectoralis major, you'll be able to see that right at the center of the chest sits the sternum, which is what creates that space in between the collarbones. Looking at this reference photo, we'll be able to spot that space between the collarbone, which will always sit right at the pit of the neck. And from that space will always come the center of the chest. So when I'm actually drawing this out, once I get to the neck and collarbone area, I'll know that where that space is in between those two collarbones is where the center of my chest will come from. So in this instance, here I have my two collarbones in red, and right at the center of them is that space in between, which is at this point right here. And from that point, I can draw a line down, which will represent the center of the chest. Which from there gives me enough information to be able to place the rest of the chest accurately according to that center line. Now, what I don't want to happen is to draw this figure and have it to where the center line of the chest is here, for instance, because it does not line up to the point in between the two collarbones, which doesn't really make this possible. So for example, if I just draw the clavicle alone, here's the point right at the center, which means that the center of the chest will come from that point. The center of the chest cannot come from here because, as we just established, it does not line up to that center point at the clavicle. So if I just left it there like that and kind of try to play it off as though it was okay, it will unfortunately always be an inaccurate representation of the chest. Because we have to remember that what we're actually drawing there with that center line and what it represents is really the sternum that sits at the center of the ribcage, which is of course made up of bone, and bones, as you'd probably expect, aren't really that malleable like that. So if the sternum doesn't line up with the clavicle, you'd kind of be dislocating your poor figure's sternum. So going back to this drawing, if I wanted, I can keep the center line for the chest there, but it just means that I'd have to shift the position of the clavicle so that it lines up to the center line, which would give you a much more accurate depiction of the chest. Now for me, this is one of the reasons why the clavicle is so important to drawing the chest, because the center of the chest is essentially the center of the entire figure. And wherever the center line is will tell me which direction the chest is facing. So here I have the clavicle in red, which tells me the general orientation of the chest, being that the center of the chest will come down from the clavicle. And then from there, I'd be able to draw the rest of the chest according to that. If I wanted the chest facing a different direction, I'd have to shift the position of the clavicle like this, while also being able to keep the same position for the head. The idea here is basically the same as drawing a crosshair on a circle to determine the direction the circle is facing. You find where the center of the circle is, you find the angle of the subject. This is why just placing a set of collarbones anywhere on the circle like this is the same as placing the crosshair, because the center of the clavicle is the center of the chest, thus being the center of the whole figure. One thing I want to say too though is just because the center of the chest is bone doesn't necessarily mean that you have to draw the line for the center of the chest straight up and down like this. If you look at this model here, you can kind of see that as I turn it in space, the muscles of the chest naturally create a slight curvature at the center depending on the angle. So that's all, just to say that if the sternum starts and ends at these 2 points here, you always have the liberty to curve the line the way you want as it pertains to the direction the chest is facing. So these next few examples are just to show how curving the center line can communicate to the viewer the angle of the chest. This drawing is of a chest from a front angle, so drawing the center line straight up and down is totally appropriate in this instance. Here the chest is facing slightly to our right, so I can draw a slight curve at the center. In this example, you'll see that if I drew just a straight line at the center with this angle, it'd kind of look a bit off, so a curved line would fit a lot better. So the next thing about the clavicle that makes it so important for drawing the chest is the fact that if we look at this diagram here, you'll see that there is what is called the clavicular head of the pectoralis major, which is essentially the upper chest. What I wanted to highlight though is how that upper portion of the chest you can see attaches directly onto the clavicle itself, starting almost right where the clavicle meets the sternum. And the end point of that upper portion is where the clavicle goes back in space. And what I mean there is that the clavicle is shaped like the handlebars on a bike. So if this is the starting point of the upper chest where the clavicle meets the center, the end point would land at a point about right when the clavicle goes back in space. And so the reason why I think this is so important is because being that the upper chest is literally attached to the clavicle itself, by drawing the clavicle you're also drawing the upper chest at the same time. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone there. So here, the clavicle is also acting as the upper chest, and this is pretty much the same for almost every figure that you draw. And the same could be said for this figure here. Just for example with this drawing here, if I erase away the clavicle, I'm also erasing away the upper chest for this drawing, so part of the chest just kind of looks missing. So even with a pose like this, where I can't necessarily see the collarbone itself, just by knowing that the upper chest is attached to it, I can picture how the upper chest would wrap around the body just by imagining the collarbone and the upper chest as the same thing. So the next thing that is very important to keep in mind when drawing the chest, in my opinion, is knowing how the deltoid connects to the chest. So for starters, you'll see that in any diagram, the anterior deltoid, which is the front delt, attaches right at about where the upper chest ends and runs along the entire length of that upper portion of the chest, basically connecting the two together. So going back to this diagram, knowing that the delt attaches directly to the upper portion of the chest, we can confidently say that the deltoid will attach along the entire length of that upper chest like this, and then round out like that. Also notice how a portion of the middle and lower chest will be covered completely by the deltoid. So when it comes to actually drawing this out, all we have to do really is to follow all of the information that we observed through studying the actual anatomy. So here we have a guy's head. Now we know that the upper portion of the chest starts at this point on the clavicle where it meets the sternum. So from that point we can draw a line down like this, then back up to the clavicle, creating this triangular shape that will represent the upper chest. Then at this point, like we studied beforehand, will be where the deltoid attaches to and rounds out like this. And since we know now that the delt is directly attached to that upper chest, it's going to go up and along the length of that chest muscle to about the same attachment point on the clavicle. And this is what gives you that wedge shape of the deltoid. Now from here, if you go down the length of the upper chest to where it ends, at about that point, that's going to be where the lower chest is going to come out from. And so pretty much at this point, you will have successfully drawn a pretty accurate depiction of the chest. And so now that we know the geometric shapes these muscles create, you'll be able to observe these shapes on real-life references. It's actually because of the way the deltoid attaches to the chest that a very common shorthand technique for drawing the chest and shoulders is to combine them into one big shape like this, just basically omitting the line that would separate them into two muscles. This is why it's so important to understand what's actually going on underneath regarding the real anatomy, because oftentimes a shorthand technique is derived from the real thing in order to dumb it down. So just because those shapes aren't present in this drawing, it doesn't mean they're not there. So here, for example, if I just extended this line, you'll see that it will eventually attach right at the same point on the clavicle where the clavicle meets the sternum. And by going up from where I extended that line initially like this, you'll see that even though I hadn't placed these shapes here at the start, it's because of the foundation that this shorthand technique is built on that I'm still able to place these shapes accurately and connect them all seamlessly to the lines that I had already put down. And here are just a few examples of how you'd be able to still map out those shapes even if you combine the shoulder and chest together. This is why the shoulder plays such a big part in drawing the chest, because most times what determines the actual shape of the chest will depend on where the shoulder is in any given pose. For example, in this drawing, placing the shoulder here would give me a different overall shape for the chest as opposed to if I placed the shoulder here. So if I placed it here, I'd have to draw the rest of the chest in such a way that it accommodates for the shoulder being in that position. If I place the shoulder here, it would give the side of the chest it's attached to much more of a stretched sort of look. Now for the other shoulder, I can make the decision to place it here, but then I'd have to shift the collarbone to accommodate for that position because the shoulder is attached to the collarbone the same way the chest is, which will in turn give that side of the chest a much more squished look. If I place both of the shoulders here like this, again, I have to consider all the same things in regards to the clavicle. Wherever the shoulder goes, the clavicle follows. So now, keeping all of this information in mind, for me, the actual chest itself kind of just boils down to 3 lines. That being the center line, the line to the left of it, and the line to the right of it. This is actually kind of the extent of the whole chest when it comes to trying to draw it in a simplified way. From that point, the chest is pretty much done, and all I need to do is to refer to all of the information that we studied earlier to complete that drawing of a chest. And so here's just a few examples of how I can draw a chest with just these 3 lines. Remembering that wherever the center is lines up with the center of the clavicle. That's pretty much how I know where to place it. And then once I have the clavicle, the only thing left to complete the chest is to put in the shoulders, which will always come out from where the lower chest leaves off like this. And then from that same point where the lower chest ends, goes back to the clavicle, and then you'll be able to complete the shape of the shoulder with a curved line. And this is essentially going to be the same exact process every single time. So again, just to emphasize that this point where the lower chest stops is going to be where the deltoid begins, which will play a big role in dictating the overall shape of the chest. From that same point, it will go back to the clavicle, and this will allow you to get the shape of the delt as it connects to the chest and the clavicle. By extending that line from that point like this, it will actually determine the position of the arm, since the deltoid attaches to about the same area on the arm that the chest is attached to. So essentially, whatever direction I extend that line in is the same direction that I'd like the arm to extend in. However, in this case, I'd have to move this whole thing a bit closer to the clavicle, since having it out that far doesn't really work when the arm is extended up like that. Here are just a few more examples of how I draw the chest, shoulders, and arms using all of that information. Now at this point you might be asking, what about the female chest, right? They have boobs. How does this translate over to that? Now, in all honesty, drawing the breasts is a separate video entirely, but for now I can say that the female anatomy of the chest is pretty much the exact same as the male chest, apart from the breast, of course, which isn't actually a muscle, but a collective of fat, glands, and tissue that kind of just sits basically on top of the pectoralis major. So with these three lines, I'd keep it the same concept, except I'd just kind of curve those lines a lot more, depending of course on the size of the breasts themselves. And from there, it's pretty much the exact same concept as before. It's all really, it's the same skeleton, the same muscles, it's all the same thing. With this drawing here, I just wanted to show how all the shapes that we use, as well as all the connection points and all that jazz, is the same thing even on a female figure. So finally, you guys, that is going to be the end of this video on drawing the chest. Since my last video, I was able to surpass 10,000 subscribers here on YouTube, which is insane considering I just started really making videos like only a month ago. So thank you all for being here, and of course thanks for watching, and I will talk to you on the next one. Goodbye.